Sorry about that. Once again, I want to welcome everyone to our worship service this morning. If you were here last week, you know that we started a new kind of Thanksgiving sermon series. My mind's a little off right now. Please be patient. And so the series is entitled Enthusiastically Thankful. And last week what we did is we looked at various passages in the Bible that talked about how important it is for us to give thanks, how important it is for us to live, enthusiastically thankful in our lives. It needs to be more than just a passing thought that, God blesses us all the time. He's good to us all the time, and there's so many ways that, if we would just take time and reflect on all the things that God does for us, then hopefully we would return with a thankful heart from that time of reflection. And so, like I said, last week we focused on a thankful heart and some habits that we can incorporate into our lives that could help us grow into living with a thankful heart. And so we're going to continue with this theme this morning. But this morning, I want us to focus on the fact there are times in our lives when our hearts prevent us from really living enthusiastically thankful. There are times in our lives where our hearts are troubled, and if we're living with a troubled heart, it will be impossible for us to truly be thankful as we're living. And so I want to get things started this morning by having you just think. You don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to shout anything out. If you want to, you can, obviously. But how many of you have ever, let me change the question. Have you ever had a troubled heart? Has there ever been a time in your life when it seems like the circumstances of life have knocked the wind out of your sails? Like you seem like everything was going well, everything was going good, and then all of a sudden something happens and like all your energy is gone, your motivation is gone, your joy is gone. Like everything is gone because circumstances change drastically. Maybe things at home or at work, weren't going well at that point in your life. Or maybe your health took a turn for the worse, or maybe it wasn't you, maybe it was a loved one and their health began to fall. Maybe your life just seemed to be going completely out of control. Like I don't know about you, but there have been times in my life where I felt that way, like no matter what I did, no matter what I said, things seemed to be out of control and were bad and going worse. And like I said, they're thinking back to that, just times in my life, and maybe you're reflecting, and our personal experiences are going to be probably vastly different, but there are times in my life, there were specifically one, where a troubled heart was probably a mild way of saying what I was experiencing personally. Like it seemed like all aspects of my life were just a wreck. Things were difficult. I was anxious all the time. I was frustrated all the time. I was discouraged. I was exhausted. I couldn't sleep. I had migraines. My heartbeat became irregular, and that just caused more stress because it would be like, ding, 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 ding. I was like, did I just die then? Did I? And when you can physically feel your heartbeat, you know something's wrong with your heartbeat. Like typically your heart's beating all the time, you don't think of anything of it, but when it starts beating irregularly, you physically can feel your heartbeat. And that's kind of that, all these things in my life, like spiritually, emotionally, relationally, physically. Honestly, physically, I was probably in the best shape of my life at that point, but all the other aspects of my life were just terrible. Just discouraged, frustrated. I was a wreck. My life was a wreck. Maybe you've experienced something like that in your own life. Possibly, maybe you're experiencing something like that right now. So, I want to share something with you that you probably already know. Like, oftentimes when I stand up here, I don't pretend to think that I'm sharing things that you don't know, but I do want to share things that are important that you need to be reminded of, because in the midst of troubling times, in the midst of difficulties, oftentimes we're so consumed by the circumstances of life that we fail to remember that there's something bigger that we can turn to. Living with a troubled heart can leave you exhausted and defeated and incapable of experiencing true joy and true thanks in your life. And so this morning what I want to do is I want you to turn to John chapter 14, and we're going to spend all of our time, or at least the majority of our time there in John chapter 14. And as you're turning there, I believe what we're going to see in John 14 is Jesus addressing how to overcome a troubled heart. And as we look at the passage, initially I think we need to look a little bit before John 14, but ultimately he's going to address how in fact, all of us are going to face trials. All of us are going to face difficulties. He promised us that if we're going to be his followers, then we are going to be persecuted. Like all of these things, none of this is new to you. You experience difficulties in various aspects of your life, whether it's your physical life, your emotional, relational, spiritual. We all face trials and difficulties in various ways. But what I want you to understand is this, is that your heart is not the victim of your circumstances. Your heart is not the victim of your circumstances. And I want you to understand that because it's the complete opposite of what the world wants you to believe. You see, the world wants you to believe that if the decisions were made differently, obviously there'd be a different outcome. If the situation would have just gone differently, you'd be okay, and if those things didn't happen, then things would be all right, or if you'd have had the opportunities that other people had, then your life would be different, and things would have turned out better for you, and you wouldn't be in the situation that you're in right now. The world kind of wants you to believe that you're just the victim of the circumstances that you're in. If people would treat you differently, if your job would have turned out differently, or if this project would have been better, or if this homework or assignment or test would have turned out better, then your life would be better, you'd be happy, you'd be grateful, and you can't experience that. The world wants you to believe you can't experience gratitude if the circumstances of your life aren't good. If you see yourself as a victim, and you live with a troubled heart, let me tell you something. It is impossible for you to experience the joy and the abundant life that Jesus wants to lead you to. And we have to recognize that, because until we're able to understand and accept that truth, we aren't the victim of our circumstances, and as long as we live with a troubled heart, focusing on the difficulties and the struggles and the circumstances of life first and foremost, as we continue to do that, it will be impossible for us to experience the abundant life that Jesus wants to lead us to, all right? And so, as I said, in John chapter 14, Jesus is addressing his disciples, and he's specifically talking to them about overcoming their troubled hearts, because they were in a time in their lives where their hearts were troubled, all right? And so before we read from John 14, you need to know what's going on in John 13. In John 13, what we see is that Jesus and his disciples are celebrating the Passover. The Passover was meant to be a celebration. Right? It's meant to be a celebration of all that God has done in the lives of the Jewish people, thinking back to Exodus when they were all enslaved by the Egyptians. All right? And so God, the Passover was, the plagues that God, poured out into that area, some affecting just the Egyptians, some affecting all the people. And the 10th plague was the plague of the firstborn. And God told Moses to tell the people, hey, take this sacrificial lamb, slaughter it, put the blood around the door in your homes, eat the lamb, and be ready to go, because the Egyptians are going to let you go after this happens. And so when God sent this destroying angel to take all the firstborn male in Egypt, whether animal or human, if people didn't have that blood over their door, then they would lose their firstborn sons. And so what happened was God sent this angel, this destroying angel, killed the firstborn males of Egypt. Egypt finally says, Pharaoh finally says, go, get out of here. We don't want you here any longer. And he sends them away. And it says that they were so favorably disposed of the Israelites that they were even just giving them money and clothes and just go, just get out of here. And they plundered the Egyptians, the Bible says. And so the Passover was supposed to be a reminder for the people of Israel of God's faithfulness. Like God said, hey, your people are going to be enslaved after 400 years. I'm going to free them and lead them to this promised land. And that's exactly what God did. And the Passover meal that they were eating was a reminder of God's goodness and faithfulness, and the Passover lamb that was sacrificed, that the blood of the lamb was shed, and so their blood, their children's blood, wouldn't be shed or taken away. It was meant to be a celebration, reminding people of God's goodness and faithfulness. And so in John 13, they're eating this meal, supposing to be a celebration. Jesus does something unusual because during the meal, he gets up and he takes his outer garment off and he wraps a towel around his waist and he begins to wash his disciples' feet. So that was kind of a weird situation there, because normally it was the servant who was supposed to do that, the lowest person, the slave, that was supposed to wash everyone else's feet. And so now Jesus, the teacher, and they had already identified Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, and he gets up and he starts washing their feet, and some of them, Peter is like, hey, don't wash my feet, and he's like, well, if I don't wash your feet, then you don't have a part of my kingdom. And then Peter's like, hey, wash my whole body, and Jesus is like, you don't need a bath, you just need me to let me wash your feet. I want to give an example for you. And so he tells them what this means, hey, I am serving you, go and do likewise, serve one another. And so he's teaching them this in this celebration meal. But the celebration quickly comes to an end, because, at the end of the meal, it turns very serious, because Jesus drops 3 bombs on the disciples, all right? The first bomb is this. He's talking to them during the meal, and he says, one of you is going to betray me. And he talks about how and he doesn't identify who it is. You can read Matthew's gospel and Luke's gospel, and you put them all together and you get a bigger picture of what's going on. And it seems like he hints at, he's like, hey, whoever I give this, in one gospel it says, I'm going to dip this piece of bread, and then who I give it to is the one who is going to betray me. And I don't know if it just goes over the head of the other disciples, but they have no clue who this was. And they're all like, surely not me, Lord, not me. But that kind of rocks their world a little bit, because these guys have been with Jesus for 3 years. These guys have listened to Jesus teach, and they've sacrificed with Jesus, and they served with him, and they were sent out to preach, hey, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near, and they come back, and they're able to cast out demons, and everyone's been doing this. All his disciples have been doing this. And so when he says, one of you is going to betray me, they literally have no idea who it's going to be. And so that kind of rocks their world a little bit. And then he goes on to, after that, he predicts that all of his disciples were going to abandon him. And if you read the other Gospels, we always look at Peter at this point, because he's like, Lord, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. I will never abandon you. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And so that kind of rocks their world once again, because, just like Peter, all the other disciples said, even if we have to die with you, we'll never disown you. And you can see Peter's heart is good, because when they actually go to the Garden of Gethsemane, he has a sword, and he takes the sword. He's ready to fight this mob of people that have come out with weapons to take Jesus, and he pulls his sword out, and he tries to, I guess, take off the head of one of the servants that are there, and he just only clips his ear off, and Jesus heals the guy's ear, and he's like, put the sword away. Those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. And so he was kind of passionate about it, but the fact of the matter is, Jesus was exactly right, that he denies Jesus 3 times, and all the disciples, as well as Peter, abandon him in the garden. And so he makes the first prediction, hey, one of you is going to betray me. all of you are going to abandon me and disown me, kind of. And the third one was that he was going to be leaving them. And so the combination of all these three things have kind of rocked their world, and that's what takes place in chapter 13. And so in 14, as we pick things up, we're going to see three things, three truths concerning how his disciples, and we can apply these things to us as well, can overcome a troubled heart, because these guys had a troubled heart. And Jesus identifies it on a couple of occasions, that their hearts were troubled. And so in John 14, verse 1, we see the first truth, or the first thing I want to focus on this morning, and that is they need and we need to live with faith in Jesus. If we want to overcome a troubled heart in our lives, we have to live with faith. And John 14:1 says this, Jesus is talking, he says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believed in God, believe also in me." And so there's just a couple of things I want to point out in this one verse. First of all, he starts by saying, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." And this tells us something very important, and that is the fact that we have a choice. Now, he's not saying, hey, don't let your hearts be troubled when there's nothing we can do about it. Like if we were an innocent victim in how our hearts were and how our minds were, and we couldn't do anything about it, he wouldn't tell us, don't let it happen, or don't live in this circumstance. And so by him saying, do not let your hearts be troubled, he's letting us know that, hey, you have a choice. You can make a difference. You're not a victim of your circumstances. And Jesus begins his teaching by telling his disciples to choose not to live with troubled hearts. Don't live just focusing on the circumstances and the failures and the difficulties and the frustrations of life. Don't focus on those things. Live with faith in him. He goes on from there, and he says, you believe in God, believe also in me. I want to point out something, because I do this because when we hear the word believe, I think it means something different than what it's intended to mean. Because oftentimes we have this understanding of believe, and it means to understand something, or to know it, or to intellectually accept it. All right? Like sometimes when we use the word believe, it's just an intellectual acceptance of something. Like I believe 2 + 2 = 4, or I believe some general fact. Like, okay, we believe it. That's not what Jesus is saying here. The word that we can use for to know, to understand, or to intellectually accept is the Greek word sunemi, all right? So that's the word there. That means to know, to understand, or to intellectually accept something. That's not the word that is used in this passage. The word that's used in this passage is a word pistuo, all right? It's the next one up there. And it means to have faith or to believe with conviction. So anytime you see the word, 99% of the times when you see the word believe, and 100% of the time that you see the word faith, it's this word, pistuo. And it means to have faith in. It's like believing enough. It's believing with conviction. Believing that leads to action. Like the exception to this rule is when James is writing about faith, all right? And he's talking about what living faith is and what dead faith is. And he said, hey, when we say we believe something and it doesn't change anything, that's a dead faith. And this dead faith, he still uses that word pistuo there, but he's saying it's not a real faith. It's not a real belief. You're just intellectually accepting it. He said, faith causes us to change. It brings transformation in our life. It leads to living differently. Faith is a transfer of trust from trusting in ourselves or trusting in our circumstances to trusting in God. And that's what he does here. He's like, hey, do not let your hearts be troubled. Hey, you have a choice. Believe in God. Have faith in God. You've done that. He's been your father, and you've been following him. And Jesus says, trust also in me. And I think he does that because of what he's going to say for the remainder of the chapter. He's like building a foundation, like trust me. Right? Put your hope, put your trust in me. Because I am worthy of believing. Jesus requires us to transfer our trust, and it applies to them as well as to us. The disciples, they were troubled because the world that they knew, like their last 3 years of life were a certain way, and everything in their lives was about to change. And maybe you've been there personally where you thought things were going great. The disciples had Jesus around, and they were amazed at his teaching, and they were amazed at the miracles that he was performing, and they understood who he was. And sometimes we just gain strength from people around us. Like if someone around us is confident and knowledgeable, we're like, hey, I'll hang around them, and if something comes up, they can take care of it. And honestly, I would be like that if Jesus was around, walking. I would follow him, and hey, someone has a question that's a challenging question, he's got it. I don't have to worry about it. Sometimes we're like that, and the disciples, I think, were like that. They were so used to having Jesus around and so used to seeing his power and his authority, and he taught like no one else taught before. And later on in Acts, when people looked at them, they recognized they were unschooled and ordinary men, totally different than the impression that Jesus had on people. Because the question that people always ask of Jesus when he was teaching was where did he get his learning from? Where did he get his education from? How does he know so much? How does he teach with authority? No one walked away from Jesus saying, hey, he's an unschooled, ordinary man. The question that they had to wrestle with is this guy a prophet? Is this guy the Messiah that is written about in the Old Testament? Who is this guy? And so there's a strong distinction between who Jesus was and who his disciples were concerning the impression that was made on people that they were teaching. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus talks to his disciples, and he's like, hey, they were troubled because their world was about to change, but he's like, just trust me. Things are going to be changed. You are going to face difficulties. You're going to face trials. You're going to have to overcome some things. There's going to be frustrating times in your life, but just trust me. Live with faith. Don't necessarily cower in the circumstances, because if we just look at the circumstances, things go from bad to worse. And he's like, focus on me. Live in faith with me. And that kind of leads us to the next thing, the next truth, or the next focus I want to make. And secondly, we see that we need to live with hope in Jesus. So we need to live in faith with Jesus, but we also need to live with hope in Jesus. And looking at the next couple of verses, it says in John chapter 14, verses 2 through 4, Jesus is saying this, my Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place that I'm going. And so Jesus, he starts this section here, and we're going to look at, a significant portion, through 11 in this point here, because all of it's kind of wrapped up in the same idea. But essentially what he's trying to accomplish is here in verses 2 through 4. Because in verses 2 through 4, what he's trying to do is he's trying to help his disciples see that there is something beyond this life. There is something beyond the circumstances of this life that they can look forward to. He's like, you have something to put your hope in. He's like, look, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place, I'm going to come back and take you to be with me where I am. But much like us, the disciples missed the point that Jesus was trying to accomplish. They missed the encouragement that he was trying to provide for them, this focus of hope, like, hey, I know you're troubled. I know what I just told you is going to happen with someone betraying me and all of you disowning me and me having to leave you. I know that's overwhelming and it's frustrating and it's discouraging and your hearts are troubled. But there's reason to have hope, and he points them to this hope. But instead of seeing the hope, what the disciples see, we see Thomas respond in verse 5. He says, Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going. So how can we know the way? And so instead of hearing about, hey, Jesus was going to go and prepare a place for them and that he was going to come back and take them to where he prepared this place for them, all they heard was the last thing Jesus said, you know the way to the place that I'm going. They're like, "We don't even have an idea where you're going. We don't know why you're going there. We don't want you to go anywhere. We want you to stay here. We don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way to where you're going?" And Jesus answered him, "I am the way. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And he said, "If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on," he says, "you do know him and have seen him." So Jesus is saying, like, hey, look, in the past, you've believed in the Father, and now I'm telling you to believe in me, because fast forward a few verses, you've known me, and he's pointing out that he and the Father are one. And literally in 3 more verses, or 3 more chapters in John 17, this is the prayer that he has. Like, help them see that we are one, that the Father and the Son are one. He's like praying for the fulfillment of what he's talking about here. That from now on, you do know God. Not just know about him. They literally know him because they have seen Jesus and they knew Jesus. And Jesus perfectly exemplified the Father in human form. And so once again, his statement was meant to bring encouragement, like, hey, you can trust me. You can trust what I'm doing. I mean, I and the Father are one. I have this authority. I mean, it's all insinuated in the fact that they are one. Then he goes on Philip speaks up after this. And once again, he appears to have missed the point of encouragement. After Jesus says, from now on, you know the Father, you know him, and have seen him, Philip's like, hey, Jesus, can you show us the Father, and that will be enough? At times, I know I wouldn't be any better. I honestly, I do know that, but at times I just sit there scratching my head like Jesus literally just said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And Philip's like, hey, can you show us the Father? And if I was you, I'd be like, you're looking at him. We are one. But Jesus has a lot more patience than I do. And so when Philip says, show us the Father and that will be enough, Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, well, maybe Jesus does get a little frustrated. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least, if you can't do anything else, believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Like they had watched Jesus raise the dead. They had watched Jesus, someone who was crippled from birth or blind from birth. They were completely healed. They watched Jesus, cast out demons. They've watched Jesus walk on water. They've watched Jesus or seen Jesus, calm a storm with his words. They've watched Jesus do some miraculous things. And he's like, look, if you don't just believe me and what I'm saying, believe on all the things that I was able to do through the Father working in me. Like all the miraculous signs, feeding 5,000 with a couple of loaves and a couple fish, feeding 4,000 in the same basic circumstances. They were there to witness it all. And Jesus was like, just believe me because I'm trying to point you to the fact that you can have hope in the future. And so as Jesus' disciples, they struggle with embracing the hope that Jesus is pointing to. He establishes the validity and the trustworthiness of what he has to say by giving evidence of who he truly is, helping them understand. Like it's not someone random person walking up on the street and making some bold predictions. No, this is someone who has evidence. If they don't believe in him personally, then believe on the evidence of the miraculous things that he's done. Like, trust me when I say, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Trust me enough to look to the future with hope. See, Jesus knew a very significant truth, and that is where there is no hope in the future, there is no power in the present. And so I want to tell you a little story. It's I just read it this past week. And in the 1940s, there's a place called Flagstaff. It was in Maine, and it was an active logging town. There was about 300 people that lived in that town. And It was a beautiful part of the country. However, shortly after World War II, the state government notified the town of its plans to build a hydroelectric dam downriver from Flagstaff. And unfortunately, what it meant for the town was the town was destined to be flooded, basically going to make it a ghost town 50 feet under the water. And so there was this professor, Dr. Halford Luckock was his name. He was a professor of homiletics at Yale University, and he commented on the sense of futility by Flagstaff's residents. And when they learned it was destined for extinction, when they learned that Flagstaff was going to be underwater in a few years, basically everything in the town came to a standstill. All construction stopped, all repairs and improvements ceased. What use was painting a house if in a few years it would be underwater? Why bother filling the potholes if the whole village was going to be wiped out anyway? The town quickly decayed. Month after month, the village became more and more run down and ghostly. Ultimately, they could do nothing about it. They prepared to move out. The river was dammed up, and appropriately, they named the river the Dead River because all hope had died in Flagstaff. Now, Dr. Lubbock made a memorable application, and this is what he said. He says, "Where there is no hope in the future, there is no power in the present." And I want you to think about that. If you're living life right now, and all you are, if you're consumed with the here and now, if you're consumed with the frustrations and the disappointments and the failures and the troubles of your life, and that's all you can think about, and you can't look forward with hope to all that God has promised, then essentially the power that you have to live moving forward in the present and in the future is going to be gone. Jesus wants us to understand that there is no time or circumstances in our lives that we should live without hope. There's just no time where we have no hope. As disciples of Jesus, our hope is in Him and our future is secure. It's important for us to understand that. Regardless of the circumstances that you're in right now, regardless of what you're facing, I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm not trying to say just get over it. There are some difficult things. There are tragedies in life that rock our world. But no matter what we're going through, we still have a future that is secure. We still have a Savior who loves us, and He paved the way for us to live with Him in eternity. And He never leaves us or forsakes us in the present as well. He's constantly given us the hope that we need, the peace that we need, the comfort that we need if we just turn to Him. So the final thing I want to look at this morning, we know we need to live with faith in Jesus. We need to live with hope in Jesus. And the final thing is we need to live with Jesus' purpose. All right? And so we're just going to quickly look at this. In John chapter 14, verses 12 through 14, I want you to notice that Jesus shifts His disciples' attention from the things that He was doing to the things that they needed to be doing. And He says this, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing." And so for the last few verses, He's been talking about all that He was going to do and how that's going to give them this sense of hope. And now He's shifting gears, and He's like, very truly, and they've seen everything that He's done. "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son, and you may ask for anything in my name, and I will do it." And so at this point, Jesus is no longer talking about what He's doing. He's talking about what His disciples need to begin to do. And that as He lived His life in a sacrificial way, as He engaged in people and loved people and served people, He was like, hey, you need to continue that work. You need to continue that ministry that meets people's needs so they can point other people's attention to God. And I think one of the reasons that Jesus does this is because when we're in the midst of trying times and troubling times, focusing on our problems and our situation just leads to discouragement. Like the more we are consumed by it, the deeper in disappointment we get. But we can focus on fulfilling God's purpose. If we can do that in our lives, that will bring a sense of joy and purpose and meaning and significance that, like sitting on the couch and just worrying about our situation doesn't bring. But the problem is, oftentimes in the midst of troubling times and difficult times, we don't want to do that. We don't want to serve others. We don't want to show our love to others. We're concerned about ourselves, and we've turned our attention inward. And so Jesus is trying to draw, they still have troubled hearts here. As he's sharing this, he's trying to establish, believe in me, have hope in the future because of me, and also in the midst of your troubled hearts, realize you have a purpose and you have a significance, and it's bigger than yourself. It's important for us to remember that regardless of our circumstances, our hearts aren't the victim of our circumstances, that we can choose to move forward. We can choose to live in faith. We can choose to place our hope in something bigger than ourselves, beyond ourselves, and we can recognize that we have a purpose established for us. This morning, I just want to wrap things up by sharing one more thing with you, and that is, I read another story this past week. It was about a lady named Joanna who had who had accompanied her husband on this business trip. And so on the last day of the trip, the woman wasn't having a great day. Earlier in the day, her husband had said something that had embarrassed her, and if things weren't bad enough, when she tried to talk to him about what he had said and why it had hurt her feelings, he just didn't get it. He didn't understand it all. He didn't think he said anything wrong. He was probably sorry for saying it, but just didn't understand the magnitude of what she was feeling. And so he had a meeting that he had to go to, and so he had to leave for this meeting, and his wife is just stewing on this fact that, she had been hurt, she'd been embarrassed, he doesn't get it, he didn't really sincerely apologize, and the more she thought about it, the more upset she got. And so while he was at this meeting, she decided to just kind of clear her mind. She was going to go shopping, and there was a shopping area near the hotel where she was at, and so she just went there and was walking through the shops, and she went into this one shop that was already decorated for Christmas. And so she saw a set of wooden blocks on one of the displays, and it was just 5 blocks that had PEACE, had peace on it, and it was decorated with some pine cones and some holly, and it was like a nice setup, a Christmas look, and she kind of fell in love with it. She saw it, she liked it, and she ended up buying it. And so after she buys it, she remembers that she needs to meet her husband at this specific coffee shop, and so as soon as she remembered that, she remembered what her husband said, and then that led her back to the fact that he didn't understand. And so, all those feelings that she was able to clear her mind of, they've come rushing back, and she's upset about them. And so she decides, I got to go there and meet him there. So she leaves the store and heads to the coffee shop, and she gets to the coffee shop, and she orders a mocha latte and starts drinking it, and while she's waiting for her husband to show up, she just starts rehearsing the speech that she's going to give him. It's going to be, a powerful, concise speech to help him understand the hurt that he caused her by what he had said. And so she's rehearsing in her head, and he comes through the door, and he asks her if she's ready, and she's like, yeah. She picks up her mocha latte and walks out and gets ready to share this speech that she had prepared. But what came out was, "Stop, I've lost my peace." And she ran back into the coffee shop, and she frantically searched for this small bag that had these wooden blocks in it, and she didn't see it by her table anywhere, and she goes up to the counter to see if they picked it up when they cleaned up the table, and she can't find it anywhere. And she just thought to herself, what a horrible day she's had. She had this fight with her husband, she's lost these blocks, and she's like, someone stole my peace. I can't believe it. What a bad day. Someone stole it. And so they end up going home. The next morning she decides to call the gift shop. And she just wants to find out, if they had another set of blocks. And she talks to the clerk, and the clerk goes back and looks, and she says, good news, I found another set of blocks. But then she added, but I also noticed a bag of blocks under the counter here. Did you happen to leave yours at the store? And when the clerk said that, Joanna thought to herself, it's amazing how God makes things super clear. She sensed the Lord leading her to understand that no one stole her peace. And she didn't lose it. Joanna realized that she simply left her peace behind. In troubling times, it's easy for us to leave our peace behind as well. It's easy for us to just be consumed by the circumstances of life and the situations and the difficulties and the trials and the hurt that we feel. And we get consumed by that, and we begin to live our lives with that as our focus. And when we do that, we just choose to leave the peace that God provides behind. As a matter of fact, in John 14:27, Jesus says this. He says, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." God wants us to experience true peace in life. We're going to face situations that are going to be trying, that can lead to a troubled heart. But we need to know that we don't have to live with it. So I'm going to ask the praise team to come up. We're going to wrap things up right now. I'm going to ask you to stand with us as we